Rise and Fall, the story of Solomon. We're teaching through the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, and our purpose together is really quite simple. It's to understand this book and to apply it to our lives. So today we get to 1 Kings chapter 4. It begins with this, verse 1. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel. King Solomon, king. See, we Americans, not too fond of kings. Our nation began by fighting one off. Kings, no votes, no legislative branch, no judicial branch, unchecked power and influence, authority and resources. So King Solomon ruled over all Israel. Why? Why? Anybody have a kid who asks that question, why, endlessly? Me. Well, I sure did. I remember questions like, Dad, why is the sky blue? Dad, why do I have 2 arms instead of 3? Dad, why don't fish have eyebrows? It got worse because her inquisitiveness, it had no public filter. So I remember one day we were at the library and we were checking out books, and she just stared down the elderly librarian who was checking out our books, and she said this. She said, Dad, why is she so wrinkly? My response? Well, that's what a 35-year-old is supposed to look like. That's actually not true. I wish I would have said that, but rather I just cowered in embarrassment. That's what I really did. Well, why? Sometimes that question makes us laugh. Sometimes that question makes us cry. Sometimes that question makes us cringe. When it comes to 1 Kings chapter 4, why? That is the question that will help us understand this ancient passage and help us hear from God. First, a little bit of context as we try and understand 1 Kings chapter 4. The chapter is broken into 3 sections. Laid them out here. The first one is this one. It's the first 21 verses. And what's going on in this section is we get just a list of Solomon's officials. And then there's this second section, verses 22 through 28. And here we get a list of all of Solomon's provisions, a whole bunch of them. And then the third section, verses 29 through 34, it tells us about Solomon's wisdom. So if we're just reading through the Bible and reading through 1 Kings, and we get to this chapter, 1 Kings chapter 4, here's what you're very likely to be thinking. This chapter is boring. I feel that. Because here's what it is. There's a lot of lists in this chapter. Well, if we stick with it, and if we ask this question, why? If we ask why, then 1 Kings chapter 4, it will explode with insight. Okay, let's start with the first section, verses 1 through 21. We'll start here. Chapter 4, verse 2 says, and these were his chief officials, Azariah, son of Zadok, priest, Elihoreph and Ahijah, sons of Shisha, secretaries, Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, recorder, Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, commander-in-chief, Frodo, son of Drogo, from the Shire, ring-bearer. Yeah, that last one wasn't in here. I was just checking if you were still with me. It goes on. It's this list of names, and we say, well, why? Well, there were 11 officials, and these 11 officials, they were employed by Solomon to do Solomon's bidding. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't it be nice to have enough clout to get other people to do the things that we don't really want to do? Hey, you do my laundry. Hey, you wash my dishes. Hey, you clean my bathroom. If you had unlimited resources and you could hire people to do things you didn't want to do, what kind of people would you hire? A chef, a nanny, a chauffeur? Would anyone hire a masseuse and an IT guy? Because your pastor sure would. That'd be great. Well, Solomon, he's got these 11 officials, and so we should be asking the question, well, why? Why does he have these officials? Well, the first section, it continues with even more names. Verse 10, Ben-Hesed and Aruboth, Soko and all the land of Hepher were his. Ben-Abinadab in Naphoth Dor, and he was married to Taphath, daughter of Solomon. Bana, son of Ahilud. Please don't grade my pronunciation of these names. There's no Jim or Bills in here. They're all tough. Here's the question. I'm like, well, why? More names. Why? Who are these people? Why should we even care? Well, in this first section, there's actually two lists of names. The first list are these 11 officials of Solomon, and that's verses 2 through 6. The second list, verses 8 through 19, are governors. And that's actually kind of insightful, because this second list reveals that the kingdom of Solomon, it became so vast, he created 12 districts within the kingdom, each one led by a local governor. And if you take the time to actually locate all of these places on the map, well, you get this. Under Solomon, the nation of Israel contained more land than at any other point in its history. It was around triple the size of the modern day Israel. Solomon, the most successful king in the history of Israel, he achieved all his 6-month goals. Under the reign of Solomon, the nation had more power, more territory, more influence than ever. Why? Why the officials? Why the governors? Why the vast territory? Why the success? Why? See, the reason, when we don't know the why, that may be the reason why this passage feels like a snooze fest. And not knowing the reason why may also be why you're experiencing some frustration or some emptiness today. Maybe you don't know your why. Maybe that has to do with your job. You know, you're busting your tail, but nobody seems to notice or care. And you're thinking, well, what's the point? Why do I do this? Or maybe it's school. You no recess anymore. The work, it just keeps on going. You finish one assignment and there's another. And you're thinking, what's the point? Why? Or maybe it's your kids. You know, you're trying to provide and you're trying to guide, but they're not exactly nominating you for Parent of the Year. You're getting disrespect. You're getting attitude. And maybe you're thinking, well, why? What's the point? You know what you need? You need to answer this. Why? Find your why. You need to find your why. All right, well, let's move on to this second section in chapter 4. Begins at verse 21. We'll start at verse 22. Says this: Solomon's daily provisions were 30 cores of the finest flour and 60 cores of meal. Well, 30 cores of flour, do you know how much that is? That is 5.5 tons. That's a lot of flour. 60 cores of meal, or really we'd probably call that today grain. You know how much that is? 10 tons. That's a lot of grain. Here's the next verse, verse 23. 10 head of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. So that's 30 cows every day. And one cow can feed, around 800 people. That's a whole lot of beef. And you add to that 100 sheep and goats and other assorted animals. Here's one thing we can clearly conclude. Solomon, this guy was not a vegetarian. There's no tofu. There's no quinoa salad in here. So why? Why 5.5 tons of flour? Why 10 tons of grain? Why 30 cows? Why 100 sheep and goats? See, we aren't going to understand this passage until we understand this. Why? Well, one more section in this chapter is verses 29 through 34, and this is the one that talks to us and details some of Solomon's wisdom. Verse 30. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan the Ezrahite. You know what that sounds like? That sounds like ancient intellectual trash talk. Sounds to me like somebody saying, hey, our smart guy is way smarter than your smart guy. He continues, next verse. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He spoke about plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. He also spoke about animals and birds, reptiles, and fish. See, Solomon, his wisdom, it wasn't limited to religion or politics. Solomon, this guy knew a lot about a lot. Sign this guy up for Jeopardy. I mean, he would slay the daily double. Well, when my little question asker was about 4 years old, she asked me a rather awkward question. She said, Dad, where does poop come from? I flinched. But I did decide I'm going to go there. And so I explained to her the whole digestive system. And she looked a little bit stunned, but she managed to fire off one more question. And her question was this. She said, okay, but what about Tigger? Think about it. Oops, I answered the wrong question. That's what happened there. I thought, why? Why did I go there? Why did I do that? I didn't need to go there. Well, why? If we can't answer this question, why? Then we are not going to understand the purpose of 1 Kings chapter 4. And if we don't understand the purpose of a thing, here's what tends to happen. If we don't understand the purpose of a thing, then we tend to misuse that thing. That includes our own lives. If I ask the question, why are you here? And I'm not asking here in this room. If I have to go, why are you here? Why are you alive? Why do you have breath? How would you answer that? If I said, well, what is your purpose? How would you answer that? Because what tends to happen in our world is we try and find this in a lot of different ways. We say, well, I'll try this job, and maybe this job will bring the answer to that. We say, I'm going to try this relationship, and this relationship, it will answer that. Or I'm going to try this pleasure, and if I can get this pleasure, then it will answer that. See, if we don't know why we are created, then life, it gets reduced to one big old experiment. We're just spending our life looking for something, anything, that will bring me fulfillment. We're missing this. Why? Why? Find your why. 1 Kings chapter 4, you need to find your why. I know your why. Because Jesus, he taught that your why is the same as my why, which is also the same as Solomon's why. What's our why? Let me get at that this way. Revelation chapter 19, verses 13 through 16 says this. This is a vision of the resurrected Jesus. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. Coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations. He will rule them with an iron scepter. He treads the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh, he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The lasting image of Jesus. It isn't going to be a suffering man being crucified on a cross. Verse 16, on his robe and on his thigh, he has this name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Jesus, he isn't called the President of Presidents, but King of Kings and Lord of Lords, King Jesus. King Jesus. No elections, right? No votes, no balance of power. He created this world and he rules it. He has unlimited power. He has unlimited authority. He has unlimited influence. He has unlimited resources. Why? Why? Fascinating thing when you dig into 1 Kings chapter 4. 3 sections. And each one of these sections, it has a lot of verses that explains the what. There's one verse inside of each of these sections. You got to look for it. But there's one verse inside each one of these sections that explains, well, the why. First section, verses 1 through 21. This is a long list of the officials of King Solomon. Well, why? Verse 20. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. The role of the leaders, to bless the people. That's why. Section 2. Here we have a list of Solomon's provisions. Well, why? Verse 25. During Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety. Everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. That's antiquated language. What does it mean? Today, we say something like, well, there was a chicken in every pot and there was a car in every garage. Under Solomon, everybody had a Vitamix. Everybody was provided for. That's what was going on in here. See, most scholars would say this massive amount of food, there's no way all of this food was just for Solomon. This was something that Solomon made available to anyone who had need. That's why. Third section, verses 29 through 34, Solomon's wisdom. Okay, well, why? Verse 34. From all nations, people came to listen to Solomon's wisdom. Solomon, he didn't just keep his wisdom to himself. Solomon, he shared his wisdom. He used what he had and what he knew to help other people. 1 Kings chapter 4, 3 sections, 3 whys, 1 purpose. The reason Israel was prospering, the reason Solomon had what he had, to bless other people. It wasn't for him. It was for them. Most of our models of power and authority are inconsistent with God's design for power and authority. I mean, check this out. Check this chapter out. See, God, his purpose for giving Solomon authority and influence, it wasn't so he could amass a personal fortune. It wasn't so he could build a harem of pleasure. God intended Solomon to provide and protect the people, to protect them from thieves and thugs and enemies, to protect them from disease and from injustice and disasters, to protect them and to provide for them, to know their wants and their needs, to know their hopes and their dreams, to know their fears and their desires, and to provide them with safety and opportunity. Verse 20. The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They ate, they drank, and they were happy. See, God has an alternative view of power and authority. All authority ultimately belongs to God. And when he entrusts some of that power or some of that authority or some of that influence or some of those resources with us, it's not so that we can just pamper ourselves. He does it so that we can add value to others. That is not instinctual. That is not normal. That is not cultural. That is not the way of most leaders. And that is not the way of most kings, but that is the way of the King, Jesus. Jesus gives us his purpose statement. We find it in Mark chapter 10, verse 45. Jesus said this, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." When the King of Kings and Lord of Lords came to this earth, he didn't use his power to abuse and manipulate. He used it to honor and protect. When the King of Kings and Lord of Lords came to this earth, he didn't use his authority to be served. He used it, to serve. When the King of Kings and Lord of Lords came to this earth, he didn't use his power to destroy his enemies. He used it to save, to rescue his enemies. That's different. That's Jesus. And you and I, we are his followers. So how about you? You may not be the king of Israel, and you may not be sitting on a throne, but I think in this passage, we're supposed to ask ourselves a few questions. Say, how about me? Where has God given me some authority? What influence do I have? Because we all have some. Look for it. Do you lead an organization? Do you lead a department? Do you oversee anyone? Do you have a child or a spouse or a sibling? Do you have wealth? Do you have a large social media following? Why? Why do you have what you have? For what purpose has God entrusted you with some influence and some authority? 1 Kings chapter 4, it's not for you. It's not for you. He is trusting you to use that for the benefit of others. just like Jesus did.